Hello and welcome back again to All Therapists Are Jerks with Ulland
and Jo.
What, do you have a little stutter there, gotcha?
Yeah.
Awesome. So we're concluding our foray into the reality acceptance skills with mindfulness of current thoughts on today's episode.
So we decided to, discuss mindfulness of current thoughts at this point because we'd already talked about the other reality acceptance skills. And a lot of times, like the reason that we would actually practice mindfulness of current thoughts and the reason it's part of reality acceptance skills is oftentimes our thoughts are not representative of facts in the environment. So, or of the event or what we are experiencing. So our thoughts oftentimes will tell us stories, which will get us away from the primary emotions that we're trying to experience or to get us out of the reality of a situation. So that's why mindfulness of current thoughts is extremely important, especially in the reality acceptance category of distress tolerance. So a lot of times when we're emotionally dysregulated, we're pretty cognitively dysregulated too, which then influences obviously the emotion and behaviors and interpersonal and ultimately identity.
Right.
So being cognitive human beings, being able to observe our thinking and not attach to the thinking. So when you were talking about a couple podcasts ago when we were talking about Four Noble Truths, we talked about the idea of attachment and the idea of attachment of not just being attachment to belongings or possessions or relationships, but the idea of attachment to our thinking.
Right. Well, I think that's important too because we get this confusion between the way I think is reality.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that mindfulness current thought can be helpful. Just ultimately for me, how I view it is like having that distance from my thoughts that actually helps you build this idea that, I'm not actually my thinking. I'm a thinking type person, so I think all the time about things, but I think that having this distance between I'm having the experience of having these thoughts, these thoughts are occurring, but the thoughts aren't me and I'm not making them happen, that I have an observer stance of watching them, that kind of insulation or distance is helpful because I think that helps me to be a little bit better regulated, particularly during intense situations.
Right, exactly. And so there's steps to mindfulness of current thoughts. And so the first step is just observing our thoughts. And again, we haven't done our podcasts on the mindfulness skills yet, but one of the core mindfulness skills, well, the core of DBT is mindfulness, but one of the core mindfulness skills is actually observing. So we have to be able to observe what we're thinking, our body sensations, things that are happening inside of us and outside of us, so we can actually observe our own thinking. And when we're observing our own thinking, we need to be able to adopt a curious mind about it rather than a judgmental mind about it. And then we also have to be able to recognize that, like you just said, we are not our thoughts. And then oftentimes there's this propensity or this desire to fight our thinking, I shouldn't think that way. I don't want to have that thought, and we try to push it down or shove it away. And I think a lot of times with our, see, I say the word think and I feel a lot, but a lot of times what we do is we either totally attach and identify with our thinking or we fight our thinking. So we either listen to what our thoughts are saying or we try to push and suppress the thoughts rather than just observing that they're there.
So part of the observing thoughts can be helpful. Sometimes visual metaphor can be helpful, so you can see them as waves coming and going. It's this idea of not controlling the thoughts, they're just kind of coming through. Some people might do other types of visualizations like leaves on a stream or things like that. So it's more about having this openness to experiencing them and this flexibility to watching them go through because you're really just observing them as they happen. Right.
And what happens a lot of times with residents when we're working with them, if they have a ruminative thought process, they don't really recognize that thought actually comes and goes because the thought recycles itself. It comes, it goes, but it comes back again.
Right.
And they just think that they're constantly thinking the same thought. And when you do mindfulness of current thoughts, you can actually see that even though it might be a ruminative thought or a thought that I think frequently, it still comes and it still goes. It's not constantly just swirling around in your mind. That's really tough for people who experience racing thoughts. Or how do I even slow them down enough to observe them? They're going so darn fast.
Right. And also, too, it's not you're trying to analyze what you're thinking. You're also not judging the way that you're thinking, like you're having the wrong thought or a bad thought or the thoughts needing to change. It's really a very mindful stance of really, again, observing what you're thinking. And sometimes it requires stepping back or feels like you are stepping back. And I think that, again, is helpful.
Right. And when we say that, we have a curious mind about your thoughts, we're not saying analyze the thoughts. So it's not where did that come from? Why would I think that? Who thinks that way? What is that thought trying to tell me? We're not getting super analytical about them, but it's more of like, well, it's curious. I wonder where that came from. Or I wonder what the thought's trying to tell me. Or what emotion is that a thought attached to? Or I'm just observing that I have an anxiety thought. I'm observing that I have a past thought. We kind of categorize the thoughts. That helps us kind of detach from them a little bit. So when we are talking about the adopting a curious mind, we are asking, where do they come from? But we're asking it in like an open and curious way, not of like, why the hell would I have that thought?
Like I have to totally figure this out. Like I have to know exactly where this came from.
Right.
It's not that.
Like that thought came from this thought, which came from that thought, which came from this action. Like that's not what we're trying to do, but just it's kind of interesting. I wonder why I think that way. I wonder why I feel that way about myself or about whatever's happened. And then we want to notice every thought that does come and go out of our mind. And there's a lot of really great visualizations for this. One of my favorites is imagining that you are in a white room, that your mind is a white room, and that there's a door on either side of the room. And then the thought, just like a guest at a party, walks into the room and it stays for as long as it needs to stay, and then it leaves. And we're not trying to keep it there because we really, really like it. And we're not trying to shove it out the door because we can't stand it. Mm-hmm. We're just allowing it to come into the consciousness and leave the consciousness. And, leaves on a stream, you said, is a really great one. Sometimes people like to think of their thoughts being blown into a bubble and the bubble goes up and then it just disappears. Sometimes we'll attach thoughts to clouds passing by. Marsha Linehan has significant examples of that in her manual. And there's plenty of Mindfulness of Current Thoughts online to practice this, but visualization is often helpful. And then at the last part of the adopting a curious mind, it's that observing but not evaluating. So we can observe, I'm having an anxious thought, or I'm having a shame thought, or I'm having a judgment, but not like, I'm not going to judge my judging. Like, I shouldn't be having that judgmental thought. And just recognizing that it is a judgmental thought.
Also, it's important to have the reminder that you're not your thoughts. So thoughts don't actually imply action. So just because you're thinking a certain way does not mean something is going to happen, or that it means, something external to yourself.
I can actually think of an example recently. Mm-hmm. I was working with a resident on this. She had the thought that she could pull the fire alarm. And I was like, well, she didn't say that. She's like, I want to pull the fire alarm. I said, okay, so you're having urges to pull the fire alarm. And then I said, well, what can we do about the urges? I can't do anything. I'm like, oh, you have the thought that you can't do anything. So just because you're having the thought that you want to pull the fire alarm does not mean you have to act on the thought of pulling the fire alarm.
They also have the idea of catastrophizing, can start having these rush of thoughts that feels like something really, really bad is going to happen, and as though it's real. And often it's helpful to stop and think about the fact that even though it sounds logical, like these really could happen, that really you're an emotion mind, and it's an emotional process, more than a logical process.
And then you can also recall times that you've had different types of thoughts. So when we're having a ruminative thought process, it's important to be able to say, and I don't always think this all of the time. So that's another way of kind of recognizing that you might be an emotion mind. So recall other times that you weren't thinking like this, because oftentimes our thoughts, if we're believing them to be fact, or if we're really attaching to them, they increase our suffering. And so can you think of other times when, maybe I didn't feel quite this way about myself, or I didn't feel quite this way about someone else, or I wasn't having this ruminative thought process. And then you kind of want to recall how you think when you're not experiencing intense suffering. So what is my normal thinking process? That actually requires you to be mindful of how you're thinking, even when you're not in distress. Mm-hmm. So what is my normal thinking process? Do I kind of sometimes have more judgmental thoughts, even if I'm just like totally calm and fine, things seem to be going well? Do I have a lot of future thinking thoughts? Do I have a lot of past thoughts? Like, how does my mind work? And being curious about how your mind works, that way you can actually recognize when you're starting to get cognitively dysregulated too.
And sometimes we end up suppressing thoughts because we find them disturbing or we don't want to have them. And one of the things that thoughts actually do, and it's pretty well established in generalized anxiety disorders, that amount of thinking is actually to avoid like threatening visual imagery. And the threatening visual imagery is what causes physiological arousal. So what can be helpful is exposure to that is to actually start looking for the idea that I'm having a rapid train of thought or a lot of language in my mind, and that's purpose would be actually to prevent me from experiencing emotions within my body. So if I can turn my mind to actually realize like, okay, I must be avoiding sensations in my body, instead of focusing so much on the thoughts, is then to shift to like, okay, what sensations in my body might I be avoiding? And then to try to focus on those sensations rather than my thinking.
Right. So in order to not suppress our thoughts, there's fun ways that we can do this. And the first one Ulland actually just talked about was, not avoiding the body sensations that are associated with the thought. But sometimes we can also kind of play with our thoughts. And I know it sounds kind of silly and kind of juvenile, but we can play with our thoughts. We can repeat them out loud as fast as we can. We can sing them. We can think of them only as sounds without any meaning, or we can repeat them as fast as we can, as quickly as we can, as loud as we can, as quiet as we can. So the thought actually starts to lose power. It just becomes like a thought. We can also step back and allow the thoughts to come and go while observing the breath. So that would be more of a, allowing them to be and allowing them to come and go that we're kind of talking about in general. And then there's this concept of trying to learn to love your thoughts, which can be really difficult. I have a judgmental mind. I come to very quick judgments. I can be quite sarcastic at times. And I recognize that that is my general thought pattern. And so if I recognize that that is my thought pattern, then I have choices in how I choose to move forward in action with those thoughts. But sometimes I'll get stuck on a certain judgment, and I try to think to myself, like, it's hard to love that thought, right? And that's a kind of a hard concept to think of, but I actually can kind of visualize, okay, so there's this thought that recurs, and it's kind of a judgmental thought towards someone else. Like, how can I actually just love that thought? How can I say, oh, there you are, hello,
Yes.
versus like, go away, I don't want you, or like believing what the thought is telling me. So like actually nurturing the thoughts, which is can be really difficult when the thinking patterns are not leading to good emotions.
Yes. And so there are some ways to practice mindfulness of current thoughts that include, how you observe and how you mindfully pay attention. Also, tricks that you can do with like words and voice or the language of the thoughts. There's also opposite action might be helpful. And then sometimes there are tricks within imagery for how we might want to manage or be mindful of the way that we're thinking. So with the first process is to really, again, observe. So you're kind of noticing thoughts as they come and go, but it's also helpful at the same time just to label it that it's a thought. It's not reality. It's not you. It's not someone else. It's a thought.
Right. I think this is really helpful, especially with people who have thinking that they can't do something or they don't deserve something. We do a lot of that verbally with the residents. Like, oh, I can't do this. I'm like, oh, you're having the thought that you can't do that. Or my mom was really mad at me. You're having the thought that your mom was really mad at you. So just kind of, just correcting it for them makes it easier when they practice mindfulness to be able to observe it as a thought anyway, not as a fact.
And they're having this like wondering, this open kind of exploration of wondering like, well, I wonder where that thought came from. But not like a definite try to figure out and solve it type energy. It's not that. It's more about this kind of like, think of the wise old professor, like, oh, I wonder why someone else thinks that way. I wonder where that comes from. But it's an open kind of questioning.
Right. Another part of observing thoughts is, actually, I kind of want to go back to labeling. I think labeling thoughts can be really helpful. So there's a visualization that oftentimes people do is like a conveyor belt. And boxes will be going by, and you'll just, like, a thought will come in, and we'll drop it into the box that it belongs in. So does it belong in an anxiety box? Does it belong in a judgment? Does it belong in a shame thought? Does it, so we can actually label the thinking before letting it go. That can be really helpful too, because then you can kind of identify what emotion is being fed by the thought.
Which is similar because you have, like, if you label the emotion that you feel tends to lower the intensity of the emotion. So if you label what kind of thought it is, that's helpful because maybe it just doesn't seem as strong.
Right.
Or, true, so to speak.
And I think this works well for people with intrusive thinking. A lot of times people have intrusive thinking and immediately there'll be like a shame or fear response to the intrusive thought. Like, I don't want to think that. I don't want to act on that. If anybody saw my thinking or if anybody knew how I thought, they would think I was a bad person. What kind of people think like this? Especially with intrusive thinking, if you can help people identify that a thought is a thought. A thought is a mental event. It is not a command. It is not a fact. You do not have to listen to the thought. It is a thought. So one of the visuals that people will do sometimes is they'll step back as though you're on top of a mountain and just watch the thoughts come and go below you, closing your eyes and scanning your body for the first physical sensation that you notice. That we kind of talked about that before, of being able to observe the physical sensations that accompany the thinking. And then scan your mind for the thoughts to come back and go back and forth between body sensations and thoughts.
So there's some interesting things that can be done with like words and voice and tone of your thoughts. Sometimes thoughts we have just seem really real, and then we say things out loud and we're like, oh, that's doesn't sound right at all, honestly.
It's kind of nonsensical.
I can't believe I said that out loud. It's that type thing. So
that'll happen for me a lot with residents. They'll say something to me and I'll say it back to them. They're like, well, when you say it, it doesn't sound right. I'm like, yeah, exactly. I repeated exactly back to you what you just said to me. Mm-hmm. And they're like, yeah, it doesn't sound right coming out of your mouth. I'm like, mm-hmm.
Right. So sometimes things spoken out loud actually just don't seem as real or as on the money. Other things you can do is you could, as fast as having the thoughts, but then try to say them as fast as you can. And then eventually things don't seem to make sense anymore. So sometimes it's like that idea of you think of a word and all of a sudden it occurs to you that a word you've used regularly also doesn't make sense. It's just as weird, because it's not connected to its meaning anymore. So you can actually cause that to happen by trying to say a thought over and over and over, think it over and over again really fast, and all of a sudden it becomes nonsensical.
Or on the flip side of that, you could say it very slowly. So
right.
You say them really long and drawn out. You probably have multiple thoughts in your mind by the time you're done saying the first thought.
That would probably work for me because I voicemail is so hard for me. It's just come on, get to the point.
So
I'm already losing my focus.
One of my favorite ones to do is to, if I have a thought, okay, so self-involved, self-disclosure here. If I'm having a thought that is reminiscent of my childhood, I will say it in my mind in my mom's voice.
In your mom's voice?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so it'd be like, hi, Joe, this is Mom. And so whenever that voice, if it's something from my childhood, if it's a memory, or if it's a thought from a difficult time in my childhood, I will often attach my mom's voice to it, and it just seems to lose its power.
That's good. I think I tend to use a 1940s announcer's voice kind of thing, duck and cover. Be sure to duck and cover when the sirens go off. Well, you've heard me do that out loud sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah, to me, it's such a ridiculous voice. It seems so important, but was so much a part of safety videos back in the day. I think it's an obnoxious, totally unrealistic voice where they're just pumping fear into kids. So I have this idea of it it's like a sort of the nuclear era is like grim fairy tale for children. So it's kind of wrong in that way, but it's so overdone. But at one point in time, that didn't seem overdone.
Right.
But in my mind, it's overdone. It's my way of telling myself I'm overdone.
Well, the other one you do is you'll do voices from South Park.
No, I don't do those ever.
No, ever.
I don't know. Sometimes at some point in time, South Park will be like those old movies, right? Nobody will remember.
Exactly. Well, I don't know about that. I'm pretty sure people will remember.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's kind of fun to attach a different voice to it, especially if you're getting really stuck and attached in the thought, and have a little bit of fun and some whimsy with it. Oh, I like the song sung wholeheartedly and dramatically. You're having a thought and then you just sing it like Celine Dion or something.
Thump your chest a couple times.
Yeah. So it can be a lot of fun to play with your thoughts, especially if you recognize that your thoughts are causing you a lot of distress.
And the third thing we had mentioned earlier is trying to use opposite action. So with distressing thoughts, it can be helpful to try to relax, kind of into the thoughts. So relaxing your face and your body, while at the same time trying to imagine accepting your thoughts as thoughts rather than fighting them.
Great place for half smile, willing hands. Mm-hmm. So half smile, willing hands, relaxing your face and body and imagining accepting the thoughts. And then imagine the things that you would do if you stopped believing everything you think. So I like this one a lot because I'm like, well, what would you do? So you have the belief that you can't. What would you do if you could?
Yeah.
And kind of flip that switch a little bit.
That's kind of hard to think about sometimes. When someone says, oh, just imagine what you could do if you didn't think the way you think. What do you mean?
Yeah.
Not to think the way you think.
Imagine how many doors open up if you're not attached to your thoughts as facts.
Like if you had a different mind, what could happen?
Or if you just didn't believe, you still have the same mind, but you don't have to believe what the mind is telling you.
True.
So rehearse in your mind the things that you would do if you did not believe that your thoughts were facts. That kind of goes back to that same one. And then we already talked about practicing loving your thoughts as they pass through your mind, kind of almost wishing loving kindness, even if it's a disruptive thought.
And then one of the final ways, which can be helpful for many people who are more visual thinkers or think in metaphor or more creative and maybe sometimes less logical, maybe sometimes. For me, being a very logical person, I'm very language-based, and some of these can be difficult to do, which is actually good practice for me to try these things. So I try to work, I don't want to say work harder, but when we do mindfulness with guided imagery, I have willfulness at first when we do it. And then I have to kind of pull myself around to be like, okay, this is something that I find more difficult than other mindfulness, and I'm, willing to work on it. So some ways to imagine thoughts would be like boxes on a conveyor belt, that the thought comes into a box and kind of goes down along the conveyor belt, comes off the end of a conveyor belt. In a similar metaphor, could be like that thoughts are boats on a river, leaves on a stream, box on a railroad track. It's just a nice constant movement of just like coming in and just kind of passing through your mind. I think and also Joey had said the white room with two doors, like a thought comes in for time and goes. I think there's kind of like almost, I don't know, might not be a Buddhist metaphor, but kind of the idea of like you invite a guest in and they stay. And then, at some point you kindly invite them out again. So you don't really fight anyone coming in. You don't really ask anyone to leave, but you invite them in. It's warm. It's a friend, right? Here's a friend I have. Here's a thought I often have. That's what this is, and allowing it to leave again in due time. So it's kind of a welcoming, hospitable way to be.
Right, even with thoughts that you may not like. So
Right.
You still have an openness to you, like your room is open, and the door to exit is also open. So it's greeting them with basically loving kindness, compassion, acceptance, and then allowing it to leave when it's ready to go.
Right, and we really have no choice, because the way the mind works, when we fight thoughts, we just have them more.
Right.
So when you try not to think something, you're going to think it more. That's just, like the white bear study, or don't think about a white bear, hit the space bar every time you think about a white bear, but don't try to think about it. And some of the people in the study, 6 months later, they report that they just sit there and randomly all of a sudden, white bear pops up in their head.
Exactly.
Because they tried to suppress it so hard months ago that the mind then wants to have that hiccup.
Right.
Because you're trying to prevent it.
Yeah, it's almost like sometimes the thoughts get stuck in the room and just recycle around.
Yes.
And sometimes the thoughts will visit the room more than once.
Yes.
They leave, come back around, come back through the back door.
Right, that's the important part of it. Observing them leave.
Right.
Observe them come and observe them go.
Observe them go.
They don't stay forever.
No.
So this has been an episode of All Therapists Are Jerks with Ulland
and Jo.
Thank you for listening.